Good afternoon. It's Monday, the 23rd of November 2015, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Girish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson. Well, as you can see, we've decided to support the Tory party today, support Conservatives. Let's get those bombs into Syria. Let's kill a few more 100,000 people. And we're showing true solidarity with David Cameron in blue.
We will be in a bit more in a moment.
Or maybe not. Stay with us. Well, the weather is pretty good across the country. Most people reporting it's cold but bright, even some blue skies and sunshine. Norfolk a bit iffy though. It's apparently dank there. We're not too sure what that means, but Norfolk's suffering a little bit. Possibly a bit of fallout from the Plymouth incinerator, Mike.
Possibly.
Well, where's the world? David Cameron, our favourite man, of course.
Well, he's in Paris. He was talking to Hollande today and he issued a statement. It was a very good statement too. So he made a press statement following talks with Francois Hollande, and he said, "Good morning." So that's always a good start. He said, "It's good to be back in Paris, a city whose people have shown such courage, determination and resilience. The United Kingdom will do all in our power to support our friend and ally France to defeat this evil death cult." He must be talking about himself.
Yeah,
Brian.
it certainly is.
He said, today President Hollande and I have discussed how we can further strengthen the counter-terrorism cooperation between our two countries and work together to defeat ISIL in Iraq and Syria. Let me say a word about each. So he started talking about counter-terrorism, and he said we face a shared threat. We must share information and intelligence to better protect ourselves from these brutal terrorists. We must, without further delay, finally agree rules that will enable us to share passenger name records. It's frankly ridiculous we can get more information from countries outside the EU than we can from each other. And he said, and we must do more to crack down on the trade in illegal arms to stop them getting into the hands of terrorists who are determined to wreak such misery with them.
Mike, hasn't it been the UK and the US that have been giving the arms in the first place?
Through Saudi and Qatar and so on, yes, indeed, yeah.
Okay.
And then he went on to say, while we do more to protect ourselves here in Europe, we must also do more to defeat ISIL in their heartlands in Syria and Iraq. The UK is already playing its part as a member of the counter-ISIL coalition, striking targets in Iraq, providing intelligence over the skies of Syria and helping our allies with vital air-to-air refueling. I thought that was quite interesting because I understood that most of our Syrian intelligence came from Twitter. But anyway, that's another issue.
We're coming on to that, Mike.
Yes, and then he said on Friday the United Nations unanimously backed action to destroy ISIL in Syria and Iraq. And later this week I will set out in Parliament our comprehensive strategy for tackling ISIL. So there you go. We're going to have a comprehensive strategy for tackling ISIL. And then he said, his final words were, later this week, President Hollande will hold discussions with President Obama, President Putin and Chancellor Merkel. It's clear that the world is coming together to tackle this evil terrorist threat. That was clear on Friday night when almost exactly 1 week after the brutal terrorists murdered people here in Paris and sought to divide us, the world united in New York. Well, did it? That's a very good question because it doesn't seem like it did really. Here we've got Dmitry Medvedev pushing out some commentary about various things. It was really in response to what Obama said, but we'll talk about that in a second. Medvedev put out this statement. He said the Islamic State has become more entrenched in part due to the irresponsible policy of the US. Rather than cooperating on the fight against terrorism, America and its allies began fighting the legitimately elected president in Syria, Bashar Assad. The reasonable policy in the Middle East, whether it is in Syria, Egypt or Iraq, should consist in supporting the legitimate authorities which can ensure the integrity of the nation, rather than continue to destabilize the situation. The misguided examples are clear. At some point, the US assisted in strengthening of Al-Qaeda, which led to the 9/11 tragedy. These lessons support the notion that the terrorist threat can only be combated together without separating the allies into supporters and outsiders. So quite strong words there. And what was he responding to? Well, Obama had given a press conference. He had been in Malaysia yesterday, and yesterday he made this. He gave a statement to the press, and he was pretty much insisting that Putin would have to agree to target airstrikes in Syria only against Islamic State and not against any other of the sort of friendly terrorists that we've got working over there, apparently. And he said, when we were in Turkey, I discussed with President Putin in a brief pull aside his need to recognize he needs to go after the people who killed Russian citizens, and those aren't the groups that they are currently hitting with strikes. So they're going to have to make an adjustment in terms of what they're prioritizing.
So the Russians are a little bit confused as to who the good guys are and the bad. The Russians think that terrorists are terrorists, whereas Obama thinks that we've got good terrorists and bad terrorists.
And he's pretty upset that Russia is killing the good terrorists. So that probably explains this story in Voice of America. U.S. Special Forces going into Syria very, very soon, and they're intending to deploy Special Forces there. What for, Brian?
Well, basically to train the good terrorists in order to get the terrorism ramped up in order to remove President Assad, which is what they're after in the first place, which is regime change.
Or is it to help them get out from under the Russian bombardment? Could that be part of it?
Well, possibly. I think they're going to continue to go for Assad is the real aim of the aim.
So in the meantime, in the United States, not all going well for Obama at all. And now we have a bipartisan bill, the Gabbard-Scott bill, entitled To Stop the Illegal U.S. War Against Syria's Assad. So this is two representatives, Tulsi Gabbard and Austin Scott. They introduced a bill, H.R. 4108, and it says to prohibit the use of funds for the provision of assistance to Syrian opposition groups and individuals, to bring an immediate end to the illegal counterproductive war to overthrow the Syrian government of Assad. The war to overthrow Assad is counterproductive because it actually helps ISIS and other Islamic extremists achieve their goal of overthrowing the Syrian government of Assad and taking control of all of Syria, which would simply increase human suffering in the region, exacerbate the refugee crisis, and pose a greater threat to the world. So there is Ms. Gabbard, and so she gave an interview on CNN yesterday, and she said that the US, she's basically echoing what Medvedev said. She said that the US is repeating the same mistakes of the past. She said people said the same thing about Saddam Hussein, the very same thing about Gaddafi. The results of these two failed efforts in regime change and the following nation building have been absolute. Not only have they been failures, but they've actually worked to strengthen our enemy, which of course was the intention in the first place.
Yeah. Well, how does the British media report things at the moment? Let's have a look at the Daily Mail here with this astonishing photograph. I've got to say, when I saw this, I thought Christmas and pantomimes, Mike.
Yeah.
We've got Donald in the foreground with his big sword. That's to get the image of beheadings in. And then we've got the man carefully posed selling his free T-shirts. Of course, I'm taking the mickey out of this picture, but let's see what the Daily Mail's been up to here, because this is a story about ISIS supporters releasing a target list of addresses and names of people they claim work for the FBI and CIA. This is clearly designed for big panic, particularly in America, because they've got militia people named. Some of these are also named in other places on the internet, but the whole basis of the story is those nasty ISIS supporters have released the names of people that are now at risk in the FBI, CIA and American military. So here we are. Accounts affiliated with terrorist organisation Islamic State reportedly released a target list of US officials wanted to be killed, including supposed employees of the FBI and CIA. Vocative reported Sunday that an ISIS-affiliated Twitter account sent out the names and addresses of people it claims work at the US Defense Intelligence Agency, National Counter-Terrorism Center and the National Guard. So we've got some good language because it's reportedly released. This is all reportedly, and the name mentioned, of course, here is Vocative. So let's have a look at Vocative. If you go to their site, this is the image with this exclusive story. ISIS releases target lists of US officials. From Maximum Impact, the Daily Mail gets in the pictures of all the flowers for the victims in Paris. So we've got a very emotive article, but the whole article is based on Vocativ with no independent research, and it uses Paris for the emotive propaganda. So clearly what we needed to do is have a look at Vocativ and who's behind it. Well, we can do that pretty easily. Just go and have a look at their website. And this is the key man. We need to bring him into frame a bit more, Kochavi. And this is a report from the Jewish Business News. And his logic industry has been laying off Israeli employees because they're doing deals in countries that is difficult for the Israelis to get into. But here we are. Kochavi's group specialises in homeland security, in particular smart city functions that collect data and pictures through networks of cameras and sensors. And AGT, which is the other company that he's involved with, got a contract with Cisco to develop systems for Hamburg. So if you research this gentleman, you find that he's heavily into homeland security, basically spying on citizens in cities in a number of different countries, embedded in Israel. Just happened to set up Vocativ in New York, which is growing rapidly, as you do, Mike.
Yeah.
So bring in a bit more just so that we know what we're dealing with. Here's Dana Rabin. She's the Chief Operations Officer for AGT. If you're dealing Vocativ, you're really dealing AGT. And what sort of companies are they working with? Well, we've got Tata here for the links into India. TNO, which is, of course, the Netherlands. They're closely tied in with the Dutch military. We've got Hitachi, and the last one here, which I can't quite make out on screen. Apologies for that, but you'll be able to probably expand that slightly. So we've got a whole Daily Mail story based on an alleged release of information by those nasty ISIS terrorists, which seems to have been created in Israel, unless I'm mistaken. No doubt the Daily Mail will respond to that. But of course, somebody's got a different view on the whole thing, Mike.
Indeed, as just been mentioned in the chat box, let's cover it. Prince Charles says that climate change failure is the reason for the Syrian crisis. So what he's saying drought and competition for increasingly scarce resources have caused this problem. It's got nothing to do with the West whatsoever. He said, we're seeing the classic case of not dealing with the problem because, I mean, it sounds awful to say, but some of us were saying 20-something years ago that if we didn't tackle these issues, you would see ever greater conflict over scarce resources and ever greater difficulties over drought and the accumulating effect of climate change, which means people have to move. And in fact, so apparently this refugee crisis has got nothing to do with ISIS. Actually, it's to do with climate change and having to move because of shortage of water or something like that. But anyway, he went on to say, and in fact, there's good evidence indeed that one of the major reasons for this horror in Syria, funnily enough, was a drought that lasted for about 5 or 6 years, which meant that huge numbers of people in the end had to leave the land. So there you go. So, well, there is at least some voice of reason because this was issued over the weekend or a couple of days ago. And this is Terrorism and Cold Winter Refugee Crisis. This is a group of 19 scientists led by Paul Dreesen and Joe Adelio, Alan McRae and Madhav Kandekar. And they're basically saying if the climate change alarmists want to discuss the real environmental crisis on the horizon of the upcoming COP21 Paris climate extravaganza, they should be formulating plans to prevent the freezing to death of tens of thousands of refugees in Europe. And they said, well, you can see it there for yourself, even after the latest Paris massacres and previous radical Islamist atrocities in the USA, France, Britain, Canada, Spain, India, Iraq, Syria, Nigeria, and elsewhere, politicians absurdly say hypothetical man-made global warming is the greatest threat facing humanity. In reality, fossil fuel contribution to climate change pose few dangers to people on the planet, and winters kill 20 times more people than hot weather. So they go on to discuss that, and they discuss the fact that if the COP21 conference ignores the fact that these people are out in the open, perhaps under fairly flimsy canvas, if it is even canvas, that they are basically going to freeze to death over this winter, and we shouldn't be going in the direction we're going for this COP21 conference.
Well, I think that Prince Charles has got it absolutely right. If we import wood from America, we ship it in to burn it in our power stations to prevent, climate change. That's clearly going to stop terrorism. It makes complete sense to me.
Sadly, that's not a joke. We are actually converting our coal-fired power stations to wood-burning power stations and importing the wood from the United States. Yep. This demonstrates the rationality of the whole argument.
To stop terrorism.
To stop terrorism, yes. Okay. So, also over the weekend then, Bashar al-Assad has given an interview to a Chinese television station, that's Phoenix TV. And I just wanted to run through a couple of the questions and answers here because it really, he's explaining things pretty succinctly, I think. So the first question was after the various good mornings and so on. Thank you for having us in the formal presidential palace. This is in Syria. And they say when you hear about the crisis in Syria, the term civil war is often heard, but it seems like you never agree with it. You don't think it's a civil war going on in Syria, do you? And he said, first of all, you're most welcome in Syria. I'm glad to do the first interview with Phoenix Channel. Regarding the definition of this crisis, no, it's not a civil war. You can say it's a civil war when you have a certain line that divides between different components of a certain society, whether that's sectarian or ethnic or perhaps political, something we don't have in Syria. Civil war has internal factors, not states supporting terrorists who are coming to Syria while they announce publicly that their aim is to change the state or whatever they call it, to change the regime. So it's not civil war, it's simply war. So pretty strong words again from Assad, and absolutely bang on the money. Do have a look for it. This is an interview with Assad and the Chinese Phoenix TV channel. It is an interview worth reading.
And of course, Media Action was boasting that it had contacts into Syria that were helping to give those who were causing trouble a voice. So well done, the BBC.
Yep. Well, domestic military issues.
I'm going to start smiling before it comes on.
I thought this article was originally in the Telegraph, but I thought we'd highlight another media outlet instead for once. And the Telegraph pointing out that Britain had to go running to the French in order to get them to help searching for a submarine, which was apparently lurking off the coast of Scotland. So HMS Sutherland was there. There was also a hunter-killer submarine there, but they had to get French patrol planes because we still don't have any. So they used Atlantique 2 Marine Patrol aircraft to look for this submarine, which I think probably was never there in the first place. But
well, I was just saying, I need to just change the order here, Mike. Actually, let me just come through because this is the one we wanted to go for. What's going on here is regurgitating what is normal, what has been completely normal activity by the Russians over many years. Suddenly, we're making this into something new and exceptional. But of course, the difference is now we haven't got the military equipment to cope with the fact that, yes, there are Russian submarines on patrol. So the Telegraph article here is as good a place as any. Britain calls in French. This is because David Cameron has got rid of the Nimrod, which was critical to being able to look for foreign submarines. Britain calls in French to hunt Russian sub lurking off Scotland. And then bizarrely, they put a picture of President Putin in a mini submarine.
Is that the submarine they were looking for?
Is this the submarine they were looking for off the coast of Scotland? And if President Putin goes to sea specially to track down our Trident submarines, I think he's quite a president. This is there's a headline somewhere saying that adults are looking at ladybird books. This is the Daily Telegraph ladybird book of submarine warfare. It's absolutely pathetic. So the admirals have argued that filling the gap, this is Nimrod, the maritime reconnaissance aircraft that David Cameron got rid of, is a priority for the government's defence review, which will be unveiled on Monday. These are the same admirals that said absolutely nothing while he got rid of all the stuff.
Yeah.
So total hypocrisy by these senior military officers who stood by and did nothing while they watched effectively David Cameron commit treason, leaving Britain unable to defend itself. This is the aircraft. And of course, the clue as to what was going on here was that they scrapped all of the simulators within 2 weeks of the decision being made. So there was no question of this aircraft getting a reprieve because they sent in the teams to destroy all the training equipment. And this is the sort of hype on the Daily Telegraph site. Russia's military arsenal in 90 seconds. So we're really pumping Russia, big threat. This sort of thing been going on ever since the Cold War, nothing new. Here's the reporter Ben Farmer, perhaps he should stick to that actually, the guy reporting about this. Britain calls in French to hunt the Russian submarine. I think this is partly, of course, Cameron's backdoor movement to lock Britain into the French military. We haven't got the gear ourselves, we've got to beg for the French. And what does it say here? Well, this is what I felt we should say. Shoddy Telegraph propaganda spins a years old routine military submarine tactics as new. It also talks about a Russian ring of steel, Russian aggression. This is sheer propaganda and nonsense by the Telegraph. But of course, not to worry, because we're bringing in strike brigades to frighten Mr. Putin.
Well, indeed, you mentioned the defence review, which of course is going to be announced this afternoon. But apparently what we're getting is two new rapid reaction forces of 5,000 men each. But it doesn't seem to be that rapid, does it, Brian? Because we're not getting it until 2025.
Well, that's pretty rapid as far as Mr. Fallon's concerned.
Right.
I mean,
okay.
Who is this gentleman, and what are his qualifications for doing the job he's doing?
He hasn't got any, I don't think. But in the meantime, clearly they're still pretty uncertain about whether they're going to win a vote in Parliament. And as Cameron said previously, they're not going to hold the vote unless they're guaranteed to win it. So Fallon here saying no early vote on Syrian airstrikes. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, Cameron is going to announce his comprehensive strategy for Syria in the next day or two. And what Fallon here is saying is that once Cameron has announced that comprehensive strategy, it's going to be so comprehensive that MPs are going to need time to digest how comprehensive it is. And once they've had time to digest that, then they might hold a vote if they have digested it well.
And fully understand who the good terrorists are. Indeed. Because this is critical for me. If we can't really grasp who the good terrorists are, then how do we know who the bad ones are?
I know who the bad ones are.
It's tricky. I'm just going to just pop back here.
Okay.
Something I thought we should bring in somewhere. Here we are. Well, of course, we've got the rapid reaction forces, 5,000 men in each one. There are two of them.
So
that's
yeah.
10,000 men. This is not 10,000 newly recruited troops. For the British Army, they're going to be brought in from existing levels.
Yes, of course, because this is another re-announcement of a re-announcement of a re-announcement. It has been mentioned many times over the years. But what I was, just before we do move on to that story, Brian, what I just wanted to ask you about was whether you thought perhaps this reorganisation of the military to create these two rapid reaction forces, whether this perhaps Britain has been allocated a slot within the European army.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. If you watch how the destruction of the British military has gone, all of the areas where we had the real capability, and anti-submarine warfare was one of the absolute key ones, we excelled at that. All of that capability has been ripped apart. So the really important thing to counter the Russian threat, if you want to play that game, Cameron has destroyed. And then basically everything for Britain comes down to, if you look at it, SAS, Special Forces, Special Operations. So SAS has become David Cameron's private army, and that is the thing which they obviously want in Europe. They want that capability. But of course, David Cameron isn't going to solve the problem with the military. He's hiring his 1,900 spies to combat ISIS. So presumably these are the spies who are going to tell us who are the good terrorists and who are the bad terrorists. So that was just my point. Never mind the very slow, rapid strike force. We're going to recruit these spies in order to tell us who's who. We couldn't make it up, and the answer is we don't have to, really. Let's just catch up with ourselves here. I better get rid of Mr. Fallon. Well, if you want a way to destroy Britain's military capability, look no further than administering anti-malarial drugs, which are clearly causing huge problems. And this refers to the drug Lariam, which UK Column has joined in other sources warning about the dangers of this drug, which leads to depression, psychotic episodes, just the thing you want with people flying aircraft or handling weapons or explosives, the odd psychotic episode. Ministry of Defence says absolutely no problem. The US has banned this drug. Ministry of Defence here keeps saying nothing wrong with it. And in this story, a retired Major General, Alastair Duncan, is now in a psychiatric unit. We can bring a picture of him on screen here. This man was in charge of British troops in Bosnia. He's had a very good career, but eventually he was posted out into West Africa. He was given Lariam, and even when the medical advice was this man should not be given Lariam, he should be given other anti-malarial medication, he was still given Lariam. Following that, he started to have psychotic episodes. So what have they done? They've pumped him full of tranquilizers, basically, and antidepressants. And now he's so bad, they've locked him up for 10 months in a secure psychiatric unit. And his wife, pictured there, is saying, this is just horrible. He paces the floor. What I find interesting about this, Mike, is that apparently when this gentleman talks about Bosnia, his mind is very lucid. He is talking in great detail and accuracy about what really went on in Bosnia. Being a little bit cynical here, is this why they've locked him up for 10 months? Here's the comment. Medical opinion backs Mrs. Duncan up that the effect of Lariam on her husband's brain has been made worse by the antipsychotic drugs and antidepressants that he's been provided with. And then we'll just reinforce this. The MOD continues to prescribe Lariam, and it's a time bomb waiting to explode. It is, in my view, this is the wife's opinion, the worst and most insidious form of friendly fire. So you want to destroy Britain's military capability, keep pumping the troops full of a drug, causes depression, suicides, psychotic episodes. This can't be accidental, Mike. This has got to be deliberate, malicious policy. We're being attacked by our own government.
You have to wonder, after Gulf War syndrome and so on, how this stuff is still permitted to go on.
Well, we have heard from several ex-military people, if they had even mild PTSD, we've had people talking to us about being pumped full of these antipsychotic drugs. Sometimes quote as a prophylactic measure. You haven't got PTSD now, but we're going to give you Prozac to make sure that you don't become, or you don't have the effects of PTSD. And we've also had former members of the military saying to us that when they went through so-called assistance from psychiatrists and clinical psychologists in the military, they were told to commit suicide. We'll leave you to think about that. Well, who's really running the country? Let's bring in Oliver Letwin. And of course, he's been grilled recently about Kids Company. Former Education Secretary Tim Lawton's been leading the charge on this. So that nasty Kids Company has had lots of money. But the interesting thing is that, as it says here, this is a quote from it, Downing Street had an interesting Kids Company. We say until Camilla gave David Cameron a list of high-level child abusers. This is quite obvious. Everything was okay, and Oliver Letwin was happy to pump the money in until that list of abusers went across, and then all of a sudden we had a problem. Apologies for the typo there on that slide. Something serious going on. So who is this man? Well, the key thing is this is the man driving the Conservative government. We've been getting more and more information. The real power on the Conservative throne is Oliver Letwin. Of course, he's had Francis Maude as the man of the shadows. This is the man who was setting up all of the deals with Common Purpose.
You're not allowed to call him Francis Maude anymore. It's the Right Honourable Lord Maude.
Francis Maude, yeah. So this is the gentleman setting up all those Common Purpose deals. And he is the Minister of Transparency, or was, before he became a Lord. But this is the reality. These are the men controlling the British government. And the thing we need to remember about Oliver Letwin is he's Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster and with overall authority of the Cabinet Office. So he's advising the Prime Minister on how to implement government policy. He is the main person. He's coordinating constitutional reform. That's the breakup of the UK, in line with the EU's requirements. That's the treason. He's dealing with the resilience of the UK's infrastructure. Well, we know what that means. That's the breakup of UK's infrastructure. And he's reducing regulatory burdens through the red tape challenge. We won't even bother to waste our time on that. So we are saying that basically these are the men now running Britain. David Cameron is simply the public puppet that we see whenever there's any nonsense to be sold. So can we give you a bit more on this? Oliver Letwin is the man to watch, and go and have a look at the Duchy of Lancaster site, because now we start to get a real look into who is running this, and how can we show in a bit more detail. Well, Letwin, of course, was appointed by the Queen, well, on recommendation of David Cameron, Prime Minister, and presumably he took a bit of advice from Boyzone there. Important thing, there's David Cameron with his young men, adoring young men outside. So David Cameron tells the Queen what to do, and hey presto, Tory mate Oliver Letwin is made Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. And then what does he do? Well, basically they look after the Queen's money. Some of the responsibilities delegated from Letwin to Sir Alan Reid, who's the Keeper of the Privy Purse and Treasurer to the Queen. And this is the organisation looking after the Queen's billions or trillions. So whoever controls the Queen's money, I would suspect, controls her. So who else do we need? Well, just as an example, this is a financial expert who's on the Duchy Council, and she was previously, she is a non-executive director of Rathbone Brothers PLC, Hermes Fund Managers Limited, Aperam SA, JP Morgan Chinese Investment PLC, and Montenero, UK's smaller companies investment. So this is where the big money's being shoved around. And of course, for some reason, we've got Oliver Letwin hiding in the background, but simply controlling the Queen. And how do we cover this? Well, we always need a good charity. So here's the Queen's Trust. And who's looking after that? We've got Michael Marks, formerly head of Merrill Lynch Global Equities. So you're in good company there. The connection, of course, is that Sir Alan Reid is also boss of the Queen's Trust. And then we've got Sandra Robertson, Chief Investment Officer, Chief Executive of the Oxford University Endowment Management Limited, and also formerly the Wellcome Trust. So we just say, who are these people? Who elected them? What are their views and personal values? And I think we know the answer. They have no interest in the welfare of people in this country whatsoever.
Indeed.
Perhaps we should get some advice from Boyzone.
No.
Okay.
Now, whenever the refugee crisis kicked off, as you probably know, the government stood up, Cameron stood up and said that Britain was going to do lots about it. But he was particularly interested in unaccompanied children, was what was highlighted during that speech. Now, I don't know anything about this organisation yet, but this is the Refugee Council. I'm hoping to contact them later. But they have posted an item on their website saying, please act now, ask the government to reunite refugee families. And they say, if your child was stuck alone in a war zone this winter, would you be able to celebrate the festive period? Sadly, this winter, many refugees face agonizing and permanent separation from their loved ones. We think that's unacceptable. Everyone has the right to live in safety with their families. Well, on the face of it, I would agree with all that. I still am particularly concerned that Cameron's main concern, apparently, was unaccompanied children, particularly in the light of the cover-up that there is over the child abuse scandal in this country, and also the history that we are aware of with regard to forced adoptions. And I'm particularly concerned that if unaccompanied children come into this country, they'll find themselves being forcibly adopted and, in fact, never being reunited with their families again. So, on the face of it, I agree with the concern that's being expressed by Refugee Council here, but we're going to do a little more research into exactly what's being campaigned for here.
Yeah, remembering, of course, that the Nottingham, or the 3 appeal judges that gave a verdict on the Nottingham compensation case have now said that, of course, once children go into a foster home, even if the local authority puts them there, what happens to them after that is no responsibility of the local authority at all. So the children can be abused or even disappeared because no problem, local authority, doesn't have an obligation. So things to follow through. Remarkable that all of a sudden all of the information about child abuse by political figures and members of the establishment absolutely disappeared out the door because we've now got Paris. Just brilliant, Mike.
Just before we go, one announcement. This is for anybody interested in watching the Crane Report and Fracking Nightmare, also for the bailiffs that are still chasing Ian Crane at the moment. I'm sorry, there's no programme tonight, so Ian will not be at the office tonight. There's no need for you to turn up. Ian will be back next Monday, however, so you can get geared up for that.
Okay, thanks for that, Mike. It's been reported in our chat room that it's Holly Gregg's birthday today. If I've got that correct, we will say happy birthday to Holly. And isn't it interesting that here in 2015, of course, the Holly Gregg story has absolutely not gone away. What we see is greater and greater evidence of that massive cover-up by Scottish government and institutions. We don't want the police investigating the abuse of vulnerable youngsters. And of course, south of the border, we've got exactly the same thing going on. Miss Goddard appears to have disappeared, Mike, disappeared into the background. So obviously no proper investigation going on there. And I think Nigella Lawson has also put her head above the parapet and says that we don't need investigations. Is that correct?
No, Lord Lawson, her father.
Oh, her father has said it.
Yeah.
So I'm confusing him with cakes or something.
Yes.
So Lord Lawson says, no, we definitely don't want any investigations into child abuse because, well, presumably that might turn up something embarrassing to the government. So we'll end on a happy note. If you want more death and mutilation, particularly in Syria, then get out there, join your local Conservative Party, because David Cameron is the man to do it for you. We're wearing blue today in solidarity with David Cameron because, my goodness, he needs to deal with those good terrorists. There we are. Thanks very much for joining us. Thank you for those who have donated recently. If you're not already a subscriber for UK Column, please consider becoming a subscriber. We can only do what we do with your help. Thanks for watching. We'll be back same time tomorrow. Bye-bye.